students. This is Mrs. Moore with your history lecture, and this is Unit 6 on the Constitution, Lecture 2. And today we are going to talk about the different issues before the delegates that they had to figure out in planning government. And I have to admit, this is really my favorite thing to talk about. I enjoy talking about government and human nature and how power works. I find all of that pretty interesting, and I have some articles to share with you, some cartoons that I have made, in fact, so I have a lot of different things to show you over this lecture and then the next lecture for this week. So you will remember that last time we were talking about how James Madison had a plan called the Virginia Plan, and his idea was to simply get rid of the Articles of Confederation, go back to the drawing board, and that critics of that plan came up with something called the New Jersey Plan, and they wanted to keep, the main difference would be a unicameral Congress. So in Madison's plan, there would be two houses of Congress that would alter how representation worked, and the New Jersey Plan had a one-house Congress that would keep that more uniform. So representation, there are many issues that the colonists are going to have to deal, excuse me, they're not colonists anymore, are they? That the delegates are going to have to deal with that affect America as a young country. So first of all, they have to decide how will representation in the lawmaking body in Congress, how will that be determined? Will it be based on sheer population, or will it be based on states? So will each state have a certain amount of votes? Will it be how many people there are? So that's something that Madison's plan cleverly manages to come up with a sort of compromise. So we're going to talk about that. We also have to talk about the Southern economy and slavery versus the North, and how that agreement, how they had to work that out. And we also need to talk about individual rights versus governmental power, how that's going to be balanced. So these are the different things that we need to look at, to include the separation of powers period, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So let's go ahead and dig right in, and let's see. First, let's talk about the disagreement of how congressmen would be elected or appointed. Let's talk about that, okay? So, first of all, there are going to be great disagreements among the congressmen. The interesting thing I mentioned to you last time is all of these delegates, they agree on very fundamental things, such as all of the ideas that Jefferson put forth in the Declaration of Independence. They agree on those things. No one wants a king. But how to create a government that protects that philosophy Jefferson put forth, that is going to be the question. How do we do that? Okay, so lots of kind of, for me, juicy stuff. I find this to be extremely interesting because really it's all about human nature. All right, so congressional representation. This problem was resolved by something called the Great Compromise. This was proposed by Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman. And so the more populous states, the states with the most people, they won apportionment. So we know what a proportion is. It's the idea that they're going to have more representation in the House of Representatives. The lower house of the Congress is going to be based on population. That's why censuses are so important for that reason, determining how many people are and where they live, because it affects the way government works and how many representatives you get. So that matters. So that's going to be based on population. And then the states that want to protect state power, they want equality of representation in the Senate, where the vote would be by individuals and not state legislatures. So think about that just to make sure that you understand it. We know from the way that Washington saw how people were very connected to their own colonies. people are going to be connected to their states in that way. And every state is going to have individual interests. This will become particularly clear with the North and the South. So the question is, how can we make sure that a small state like Rhode Island still has a voice when compared with a larger state with more people in it, like Massachusetts? So you see my point? Having a Senate with an equal number of representatives, that's going to help balance state power with national power. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you. All right. The second contentious issue is going to be about slavery and the slave trade. Okay, so let's look at this and think about this together. All right. So an equally contentious struggle existed between the North and South over race-based slavery and the regulation of trade, which again, this fight is a fight that's going to happen even more openly and more furiously with the Civil War, but it has to be resolved for the government here to go forward. So of all the issues that emerged during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, none was more incendiary, think bursting into flames, than the question of slavery and its future. So we have to understand that the agricultural economies, the farming economies of Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, they had become dependent upon slavery. And we talked about this. You guys will remember back when we were in the classroom, we talked about the idea that there was no sort of poor underclass in the colonies where you could hire someone to do this work. And that was why slavery became an attractive, though morally reprehensible, solution. Okay? So the delegates from those states, Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, they were determined to protect the future of slavery, all right, as the federal constitution was drafted. And it's also worth noting that a third of the people living in those southern states were enslaved blacks. So we're going to have an interesting issue here. So you'll see it will kind of come out. A South Carolinian, he said that his delegation and the Georgians, they were going to fight any constitution that did not protect slavery. It cannot be stressed with too fine a point that what would have happened would have been a southern country and a northern country had the delegates not been able to come to some sort of compromise that did include slavery. And I know many of us are sort of told to think that this means the founding fathers were cowards or they weren't as moral as we would like to think. But the truth of the matter is sometimes you do have to compromise and keep your eye on the end result and also know that this will be removed eventually. I know that's not satisfying, but it's more satisfying than looking at our founding fathers and saying, why didn't they do this? Well, we have to understand why. Okay, all right. So James Madison, remember, he's really the driving force behind a lot of the decisions being made in the Constitution. And he said that the real differences amongst the delegates, it's not a small state, large state problem. It's a northern state, southern state problem. This is where a lot of the fighting is, and it's slavery. Slavery is the deal. So the delegates couldn't say we are going to abolish slavery. And so basically what ended up happening is, look at it this way. The Southerners are saying slaves aren't people. And we know this from our study of Frederick Douglass. We know this. But here is where the hypocrisy really comes out. The Southerners want to yet count slaves as people, to have more representation in the House of Representatives. You see what I mean? So, and I mentioned to you that a third of the people living in the South, those were enslaved blacks. So think about that. You're not a person, yet I need you to be a person so I can have more power in government. This is a problem. This is a problem, and it's an illogical problem. Okay, so basically what ends up happening is there was a compromise called the 3/5 compromise. Maybe some of you have heard of. So this is the compromise, that basically each slave will count as 3/5 of a person for the sake of a census and determining representation in the House of Representatives. All right, so I'm looking here to see if there were things I wanted to tell you. Yep. Okay, so let's go on. So another issue, I said slavery and trade are interlinked. The question is, can we regulate trade? What can we do to stop the African slave trade? That was something the delegates were thinking about as well. So some of the Southern delegates, of course, wanted to use the power of the federal government to stop the slave trade with Africa. Wait, the Southerners didn't, they wanted to make sure the federal government couldn't do that. I'm sorry if I just misspoke. They wanted to make sure the federal government would not stop the slave trade. And here's part of the issue. The Southerners and those involved in the slave trade, they thought that as the nation expands west, so beyond that proclamation line, moving into that new territory, remember how the U.S. was nearly doubled with the Treaty of Paris. So they thought the Westerners would want slaves as they set up their farms, and they thought that would be the next hotbed of slave activity. And the Northerners wanted to make sure that didn't happen. Let's control slavery. Let's control slavery where it is. Okay. So, all right. Let's see. All right. And so the hope was we can stop the transportation of slaves into the country. And let's see. Of course, then the Southerners and some Westerners will argue, but this is vital to our economy. So, all right. So here is another compromise to resolve that question of spreading slavery into the slave trade into the West. The delegates established a time limit. Congress was not going to forbid transatlantic slave trade before 1808. But what it would do instead is levy a tax of $10 a head on all imported Africans. Okay, so there you have it. Eventually, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, will be stopped, and until then there'll be an extra tax. So this is kind of the best they could do at this point. All right. Let's see where I wanted to go next. If you're wondering about natives, Native Americans were not included as being citizens, but that's hardly shocking news, right? Let's now go and talk about the separation of powers. Okay, so we now need to talk about the power to create laws, to carry them out, and then to interpret the laws. Those are the three powers. And one thing you don't want is all those powers in one person or in one group, because when people do have that power, they have all the power, they become corrupt. We can see that, okay? So many state constitutions already separated legislative, executive, and judicial powers. So the founding fathers were extremely fearful of the idea of what might be called a majestic magistrate or a tyrant who's determined to squeeze money out of the people through taxing, through tyrannical ways. And so what they want to prevent, what they want is to, there are kind of two things being balanced here. On one hand, we're fearful of one powerful individual. On the other hand, we're fearful of mob rule. And that's what democracy can sometimes become. When our country was established, it was initially established as a small r republic, a representative government. And that's what the Congress, meaning the House and Senate, that's what that is. However, there has to be a kind of balance between those two spheres. If we're too much on one side of giving too much power to an individual, then we might accidentally give too much power to the people themselves. And the founding fathers were afraid of mob rule. They knew that men were not angels. They wanted to make sure there was no tyranny of the majority, as it was called. At the same time, you can't be so fearful of a tyranny of the majority that you give all the power to one person. So that had to be a balance that was struck and developed. Okay, whoever's eating, I'm going to ask you to stop because dinner will be soon. I'm here at home with my children, as you can see, and I hear something pouring into a bowl. Please stop eating. Thank you. All right. So that's what has to be balanced. And the solution really is a republic, representative government. Now, over time, through constitutional amendments and practices, our government has become more democratic, more relying upon the rule of the people and their will. And that's something that you'll talk about in future government classes, I'm sure. Just speaking of mob rule, your boy Alexander Hamilton, he once called the people a great beast. So that's how fearful some of the founding fathers were of the idea of the people in groups making decisions in an unchecked way. That's as dangerous as a King George III making decisions in an unchecked way. Okay, so this is why we have a representative government. The House and Senate balance this perfectly. So, well, pretty perfectly. The House is going to be determined by popular vote directly from the people with 2-year terms, which means there's a lot of they're staggered, but there's going to be turnover in the House, frequent elections. The Senate is going to be a bit more removed from the people. Initially, delegates will elect the senators, and they will have 6-year terms, so they are less responsive to the will of the people. It's a much more small R Republican notion, all right? So the Senate and the House. Now, I actually have some different cartoons in the next lecture I will show you that kind of explains these things even more clearly, but let's turn to the executive branch next. So that is, that's going to be the president and who's going to carry out the laws. So the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, they struggled over issues related to the new executive branch. They were concerned that there would be one chief executive. Sounds too much like a king, right? In fact, founding father George Mason said that to have one executive would create a fetus of monarchy. That's a pretty graphic description, isn't it? So fetus, we know, in the womb, when a baby is first conceived, it grows into a baby, right? But initially it's a fetus, so the fetus of monarchy. Imagine a tiny, pea-sized, fertilized egg wearing a crown. It's a little creepy, but you see, you'll never forget that, right? Okay, so let's see. Here are different powers the new president would have, and then we'll talk about how his powers were checked. He'll have the ability to veto acts of Congress. However, that can be checked. That means if a law, an embryo, potential law comes before him, he can say no. You know, say Congress will use a really incendiary issue. Congress, let's say, were to come up with a law that said children don't have to go to school over age 12. Okay, and the president, who knows this would be hard on a lot of families and people in education, he vetoes that. Well, here's what the Congress could do. They have a check to that power, which makes it balanced. They have the ability to get 2/3 of the Congress in each house to vote to override that. So this is how they have the power to overcome something the president might decide to negate or say no to. All right. Another power. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, we've talked about the danger of a standing army and how there is the fear that they become the king's thugs. Well, what if the army, the military, became the president's thugs? That's a concern the founders have. Okay, and so basically you have to think about diplomacy. The president does not have power to declare war. He makes treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. Again, that's 2/3 votes. And the Senate also controls the money, the funding for a war a president would have. So if there's an unpopular war, they could just not send money to those troops or to give them weapons. But you see how that could be a problem too and make the Senate look bad? Imagine if you are out there fighting in a war that you know isn't popular, but you don't have enough bullets, for example. You see, then that could reflect poorly on the Senate or the House. It's always complicated, guys. It's always complicated. But I personally think that's what makes it fun and interesting to think about. Let's see what else. The president can appoint diplomats, judges. That's a huge one. As you know, whenever a president appoints a Supreme Court justice, we all lose our minds over it because it's a huge deal. And you know what everyone's thinking about. People are thinking about things like abortion, immigration, these issues that really people have strong feelings about. All right. The president is meant to report annually on the state of the nation. So you will recall that every January, maybe your parents watch, or they ask you to come watch with them, the State of the Union address. It's almost comical to watch sometimes because it's so divided politically. Who's clapping, who isn't, who looks angry, who tears things up afterwards. You know, it's meme worthy in some ways, is it not? But the tradition of doing that, Washington set the standard of what this would look like. So we'll talk about that some more as well. All right. So limits. Let's see. Okay. Yes, president can't declare war. Now, whereas a king cannot be removed from office, which I want you guys to think about that. A king, a czar, a sultan. If the king is healthy, he could be the king for 30 years or more for your whole adult life. And if you don't like him, oh well. That's why there are so many assassination attempts in Russian history, for example. Because think about it. If you don't like the way the czar is ruling, you can't just go out there and protest. You'll be tossed in jail. You can't just wait until the next election. It doesn't exist. And that's why there are so many assassination attempts. It's pretty fascinating stuff, but you understand it when you realize there's no way to remove a leader from power, an executive from power. So the president, of course, is going to serve 4 years. Now, the tradition of serving just 2 terms started by Washington. That needed to be made into law after FDR served a 3rd term. Again, that's a future history lesson, but I'm kind of setting some groundwork for you guys. So the president can be removed from office. The House can indict, which is impeachment, indict the chief executive and other civil officers on charges of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So that other high crimes and misdemeanors, wow, that could be just about anything. And in my lifetime, I have seen 2 presidents have impeachment charges brought against them, of course, which is President Clinton and then with President Trump. So there has to be a trial, though. Impeachment doesn't mean you're kicked out. You have to be convicted. And so 2/3 of a House vote is required to impeach a president to bring those charges. then the Senate can remove the president with a 2/3 vote. That's the conviction. And it's pretty fascinating stuff. So let's see. Okay, the Electoral College. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. And then I have a couple really interesting articles about the Electoral College. People have strong feelings about it. One thing's for sure, a lot of people don't understand what it is or why it exists, but I'm going to explain it to you. Many people think it is outdated, that it's part of that small r Republican, those Republican roots of our country, and that we should be more democratic, where the people have more to say, but it was created as a safeguard. So let's look at this. Okay. So the leading nationalists at the Constitutional Convention, nationalists meaning wanted a strong federal government, men like Madison, James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton, they wanted to strengthen the independence of the president by entrusting that choice to popular election. But an elected executive was still too far beyond the American experience. So think about this. It's the first time the people have a say in who their leader will be. And that being done just by straight democracy felt like too much for the founders. So let's see what sort of compromise they come up with there. Let's see. Wilson suggested that the people of each state choose presidential electors equal to the number of their senators and representatives. So this is how it's going to be enough to cover each state, the Senate too, and then based on population for the House. Okay, those are the electors. And I have a map I can show you in just a moment that shows you that. At least I think it's from the 2012 election. Only the most current information for you guys. So others propose the legislatures get to choose. So finally, the convention voted to let the legislature decide the method in each state. So it's going to be based on the state. Before long, nearly all the states were choosing presidential electors by popular vote, and then the electors were casting their votes. Okay, and so they were supposed to make decisions. Well, again, this is something that can be debated. Are they supposed to do what the popular will says, or are they entrusted to make decisions on behalf of the people? It's a huge question. Let me show you my map. Map, where art thou? I need some Jeopardy music as I search. I wasn't going to show you. Oh, here we go. Map, here we are. So this is 2012. Just put the document cam. See? Okay, whoops. Okay, so electoral votes. And what you are seeing is how many electoral votes each state got based on population in the 2012 election. Okay, and I'm going to talk to you more about the Electoral College, probably our next lecture, because it's pretty interesting. I wanted to get to the judicial branch very quickly here, the third branch of government. There wasn't as much debate on the judicial branch. Both the Virginia and the New Jersey plan, they called for Supreme Court. The Constitution established it. They provided specifically for Chief Justice of the U.S. and left up to the Congress the number of other justices. All right. And so maybe some of you have heard of this idea of judicial review. And this is supposed to be the power the judicial branch has to determine whether laws are constitutional or not. But believe it or not, this was implied and not an explicit power. So it took time for this to develop, and it was controversial at first. There was a famous court case called Marbury versus Madison. It's pretty complicated. But the question is, and it came all the way to the Supreme Court, do the courts have the right to say a law made by Congress fits with the Constitution or not? Because that seemed at the time to feel like a lot of power for the judicial branch to have. And the answer was yes, the judicial branch can have the power of judicial review, that it seemed like a necessary check or balance. All right. So because the Constitution is meant to be the supreme law of the land. People come and go, generations change, but the Supreme Court is there to interpret the Constitution. Now, as we know, not all Supreme Court justices are going to interpret it the same way. And that's, again, what makes it fun and interesting and a provocative political world. Now I'm going to flex for those of you who really like it when I brag about myself. I have met a Supreme Court justice. I got to meet Clarence Thomas when I was in college. There's a picture of me somewhere in a box, perhaps in this house, of me at age 18 shaking his hand. So I just know so many people. I'm so important. All right. But again, that question there is going to be, is that an appropriate power for the judicial branch? And it was decided in this court case that yes, the power of judicial review. So that is all I wanted to do for this lecture. And next time I want to talk more about the Electoral College. And I have some kind of fun cartoons that I have made based on different concepts, different ideas that come out of this era in history. So until next time, toodaloo, and I shall see you later.